The fork scraped against the tin plate with a sound that cut through the warm evening air like a blade, and Maria Garner felt the blood drain from her face so fast she thought she might faint right there at the supper table. Abraham Atkins had not raised his voice. He had not slammed his fist against the wood. He had simply set down his coffee cup with the careful, deliberate slowness of a man who had made a decision and was no longer going back from it. And he had looked at her across the length of that long pine table with eyes the color of a storm-bruised sky, and he had said, "I'd like to know your real name now, if you'd be so kind." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Maria had ever heard. The ranch hand called Denny had disappeared into the bunkhouse an hour ago. The cook, old Hester, had retreated to the kitchen and shut the door behind her. It was only the two of them now, Maria and Abraham, in the golden lamplight of the Broken Spur ranch dining room, and the borrowed name she had been wearing like a second skin for the past 3 weeks was suddenly as thin and transparent as gauze. "I don't know what you mean," she said, and even as the words left her mouth she knew they were the wrong ones, knew they were too smooth, too rehearsed, too much like the practiced deflections of a woman who had been lying for a very long time. Abraham looked at her the way a man looks at something he already understands but is giving one last chance to explain itself honestly. "I received a letter today," he said, "from the agency in St. Louis. The woman they sent me a description of, the woman named Clara Whitfield, the one I agreed to take on as a housekeeper and prospective companion, she is apparently still in Missouri. Has been, the whole time." He picked up his coffee again, took a long, slow sip. "So I will ask you once more, and I am asking because I think you deserve the dignity of being given the chance to tell me yourself. What is your real name?" The lamp flame flickered in a draft from the window. Maria Garner closed her eyes. She thought of the train platform in Kansas City. She thought of the letter she had stolen from a carpetbag left unattended on a wooden bench. She thought of the woman, Clara Whitfield, who had smiled at her in a moment of accidental kindness and then walked away in the wrong direction, never knowing what she had left behind. She thought of what she was running from. She thought of how far she had come. She opened her eyes. "My name," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect, "is Maria Garner." The name hung between them like smoke. Abraham Atkins did not move. He simply studied her, his big weathered hands wrapped around the coffee cup, his jaw set, and for one terrible moment Maria was absolutely certain he was going to stand up and tell her to leave. Instead, he said, "All right, Maria Garner, then you had better start from the beginning." And so she did. It had begun, as so many desperate things begin, with a man she had trusted far too much. Maria had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a seamstress mother who had died of a fever when Maria was 14, and a father whose name she had never been allowed to speak aloud because he was a married man of some social importance and her mother had loved him anyway, without sense or protection, and paid the full price for it. She had been left, at 14, in the care of her mother's sister, a hard-edged woman named Doris who took in laundry and made it very clear that Maria was a burden she had not asked for and would not tolerate indefinitely. Maria had learned quickly to be useful. She had learned to sew and to cook, and to keep her mouth closed and her eyes open. She had learned to read the room before she entered it, to anticipate what was needed before it was demanded. She had learned to survive. By the time she was 22, she had managed to secure a position as a seamstress assistant in a dress shop on Olive Street, and she had been saving every spare cent she could in a small tin box she kept beneath the loose floorboard under her narrow bed in the boarding house on Chestnut. And then she had made the mistake of trusting Raymond Coles. Raymond was 30, charming, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from having been told your whole life that you were special. He managed the accounts for a small importing company, and he dressed well, and he knew how to make a woman feel like the only person in a crowded room. He had come into the dress shop to order a birthday gift for his mother, or so he said, and he had talked to Maria for 45 minutes about fabrics and colors and the difference between silk and satin, and by the end of it she had been laughing and flushed and completely unprepared for how quickly she would fall. They had courted for 8 months. He had met her after work and walked her through Lafayette Park and bought her coffee at the little cafe on Locust Street. He had told her about his plans, his ambitions, the business he intended to open one day when he had enough capital saved. He had been everything she had never allowed herself to want. And then one Tuesday morning in March of 1878, she had arrived at the dress shop to find Raymond already there, talking to her employer, Mrs. Holloway, and something in the way they both went quiet when she walked in told her everything she needed to know before a single word was spoken. Raymond had taken her money. Not all at once, not with obvious theft, but piece by piece over the course of 6 months. With small loans he had convinced her to make for temporary shortfalls. With investments he had described with such compelling detail that she had emptied her tin box into his hands with something approaching relief, as though she were handing him not just her savings but her future, and trusting him to carry it safely forward. The tin box was empty. The money was gone. Raymond Coles had also, it turned out, borrowed rather heavily from 3 other women in the city, and when the weight of those debts had become inconvenient, he had moved on. He had simply stopped appearing. No letter, no explanation, no word of any kind. The humiliation was profound, but it was not the worst of it. The worst of it was that Raymond Coles had a brother named Victor, and Victor Coles was the kind of man who believed that debts ran in families. Victor had come to her boarding house 2 weeks after Raymond's disappearance and explained, with a pleasant smile that did not reach his eyes, that Raymond owed money to people who were not the patient kind, and that those people were of the opinion that Maria, having been Raymond's intimate companion for 8 months, was likely in possession of information about where Raymond had gone and what he had taken with him. Maria had told him the truth, which was that she knew nothing, and Victor had smiled his unpleasant smile and said he would give her time to remember. He came back 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. The 4th time he did not come alone. That was the night Maria had packed a single bag, taken the small amount of cash she kept separate from her tin box, and walked to the train station. She had not known where she was going. She had only known she needed to go. She had been sitting on a bench in the waiting area, exhausted and frightened, her bag on her lap and her heart hammering, when the woman sat down beside her. Clara Whitfield, though Maria had not known her name yet, was a neat, pleasant-looking woman of about 30 with a reticule of fine leather and the expression of someone running through a mental checklist. She had set her carpetbag down between them and opened her reticule to look for something, and in the process of searching she had pulled out a folded letter and set it on the bench beside her while she continued rummaging. A railway announcement had come over the noise of the station, and Clara Whitfield had stood up abruptly and gathered her reticule and walked away in the direction of the departures board, leaving the letter on the bench. Maria had sat there for a full minute, not touching it, before the fear caught up with her again, the memory of Victor's unpleasant smile, the sound of boots on the boarding house stairs, and she had picked up the letter and read it. It was from an agency in St. Louis that facilitated arrangements between ranchers and homesteaders in the Western Territories who were seeking housekeepers or prospective companions, and women who were in search of honest work and a fresh start. The letter was addressed to a Clara Whitfield, and informed her that her application had been accepted and that a Mr. Abraham Atkins of the Broken Spur ranch near the town of Millhaven, Texas, had agreed to engage her services for a trial period of 3 months, during which she would serve as housekeeper and cook, and that if the arrangement proved agreeable to both parties, a formal discussion of more permanent domestic arrangements could follow. There was a ticket folded inside the letter, Kansas City to Abilene, and then a connecting stage to Millhaven. Maria had sat very still for a long time. She had thought about what she was doing. She had thought about what she was leaving. She had thought about Victor Coles and the men who were not the patient kind, and she had picked up Clara Whitfield's carpetbag from between their feet on the bench, and she had walked to the departures gate, and she had boarded the train. She told all of this to Abraham Atkins, while the lamplight grew smaller, and the Texas night pressed warm and dark against the windows of the Broken Spur ranch house. And when she finished talking, her hands were trembling slightly, and she could not look at him directly. There was a long silence. "The agency will have sent a description," Abraham said. His voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man working through the practical implications of something. "Clara Whitfield's description." "I know," Maria said, "and you don't match it." "No, I don't." He was quiet again. Maria watched his hands on the table, big hands scarred in the way of a man who worked with rope and fence wire and uncooperative livestock. Honest hands, she had thought since the first day she arrived, when he had carried her bag from the wagon to the house without being asked, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Why didn't you turn yourself around the minute you stepped off that stage?" he asked, not with anger, with genuine curiosity. "I thought about it," she said honestly. "I stood in the road outside the stage stop and I thought about walking back inside and saying there had been a mistake, but I was out of money by then. I had used the last of it on food during the journey, and I was frightened. She stopped. "Go on," he said. She looked up at him then, finally, and made herself hold his gaze. "I was tired of running. I had been running for 3 weeks and I was so tired I could barely stand, and this was a place to stop. Even if it was built on a lie, it was a place to stop." Abraham Atkins looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up from the table, carried his plate and his coffee cup to the sideboard, and stood with his back to her, looking out the dark window. "You've been a hard worker," he said finally. "Whatever else is true, that much is also true. Hester says you're the best hand she's had in the kitchen since before my wife passed. You've mended 3 saddles, reorganized the supply room, and you haven't complained once about the hours or the dust or the heat." Maria waited. "I'm not going to put you out tonight," he said, still facing the window. "It wouldn't be right, but I want you to understand that I need to think on this. And I want you to understand that if I find out there's anything else you haven't told me, we're going to have a much harder conversation than this one." "There isn't anything else," she said. "What I told you tonight is all of it." He turned around then. In the lamplight his face was hard to read, all planes and shadow, the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something direct and unadorned. He was 34 years old. She knew that much from what Hester had told her. He had run the Broken Spur alone for the past 2 years since his wife, a woman named Ellen, had died of a fever that swept through the county in the summer of 1876. He had no children. He had a ranch of 3,000 acres, a small crew of hands, and a reputation in Millhaven for being a man of his word. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk more in the morning." Maria nodded. She rose from the table, steadied herself with one hand on the back of the chair, and walked to the staircase that led to the small room she had been given on the upper floor. She did not look back at him. She was afraid that if she did, she would see something in his expression that would break the fragile composure she was holding together by sheer force of will. She lay on the narrow bed for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the creak of the house timbers, the distant low of a restless steer, the dry Texas wind moving through the mesquite outside the window. She thought about what happened next. She thought about whether Abraham Atkins was a man who could forgive a deception, or whether he was a man who, once he had decided a thing, never came back from it. She thought, and this surprised her with its clarity, that she did not want to leave, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because in 3 weeks she had come to feel something she had not allowed herself to feel since Raymond Coles had emptied her tin box and her trust. The cautious, dangerous warmth of a place that was starting to feel like home. The morning came in hard and bright, the way Texas mornings do, with no apology and no transition, and Maria was up before dawn as had become her habit, putting water on for coffee and cutting biscuit dough on the kitchen table when Hester came shuffling in from her room off the kitchen and looked at her with sharp, knowing eyes. Hester Bramble was 63 years old and had been cooking for the Broken Spur since Abraham's father, Jacob Atkins, had first broken ground on the place in 1851. She was a small woman, dense and solid as an oak stump, with white hair she wore in a long braid, and a face that had been mapped by decades of hard sun and hard work, and the particular kind of wisdom that comes from watching people more carefully than they realize. She had taken one look at Maria on the day of her arrival and said nothing useful to anyone about her assessment, which Maria had found both reassuring and unnerving in equal measure. "You told him," Hester said, "not a question." "He already knew," Maria said. "He had a letter." Hester made a small sound that could have been satisfaction or resignation or both. She pulled her apron from the hook by the door and tied it around her waist. "And he said he needed to think on it." Hester nodded. "That's Abraham's way. He doesn't do anything fast except ride." She took over the biscuit cutting with the authority of a woman on her own territory, and Maria stepped back and started slicing the salt pork for the pan. "He's a fair man," Hester said after a moment. "His father was fair too. That ranch was built fair and run fair, and it stayed that way. He won't throw you out without cause." "Arriving under a false name seems like cause enough," Maria said. "It's cause," Hester agreed, "but it's not the only thing he'll weigh." Abraham came in to breakfast at the usual hour, just after the sun cleared the top of the cottonwood trees along the creek. He sat at his usual place and ate without commenting on the food, which was so unlike his typical manner. He almost always made some small appreciative remark, that Denny kept glancing at him sideways with the anxious expression of a young man who knew something was wrong but had no idea what. After breakfast, Abraham looked at Maria across the table and said, "Come with me, when you're done clearing." Denny, sensing correctly that this was not a conversation for general company, made himself very busy with a piece of harness leather that did not appear to need immediate attention and left without being told. Maria cleared the table and followed Abraham out through the back door and across the yard to the fence that bordered the south pasture. He leaned on the top rail and looked out over the land, which was gold and brown in the morning light, rolling out toward a low ridge of hills in the distance. She stood beside him, not touching, the space between them charged with all the things that had been said and all the things that still needed to be. "I've been thinking since last night," he said. "So have I," she said. He glanced at her. In daylight, without the softening effect of lamplight, he looked exactly as he was, a working rancher, a man shaped by physical labor and open air, with the kind of face that had been lived in rather than merely worn. There were lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun and lines at the corners of his mouth that suggested he had laughed more in his past than the last 2 years had given him occasion to. His hair was dark with threads of gray beginning at his temples. His eyes, she had noticed very early on, were the kind of gray-blue that changed with the light, darker in shadow and almost silver in full sun. "What I keep coming back to," he said, "is not that you lied. I understand the circumstances well enough that I can follow the logic of it. What I keep coming back to is whether you would have told me if I hadn't received that letter." The question landed with the accuracy of something thrown precisely. Maria considered it honestly, which was, she understood, the only way left to her now. "I don't know," she said. "A month ago I would have said no, but these past 3 weeks," she stopped, rearranged her thoughts. "I have found it harder and harder to maintain, not the work. The work is straightforward and I am glad of it, but sitting at that table with you every evening talking about the ranch and the cattle prices and the weather, knowing that every exchange we have is built on something false." She looked at the fence post rather than at him. "I think I would have told you. I think I would have told you before much longer." "Because your conscience was troubling you?" he asked. "Partly," she admitted. "And partly because," she stopped again. "Because," he prompted. She looked at him directly. "Because I have come to respect you, and I found I did not want you to respect a person who didn't exist." He was quiet for a moment, still looking out at the pasture. A red-tailed hawk was riding a thermal somewhere over the ridge, circling without effort, making the whole thing look effortless. "You can stay," he said. On the same terms as before, housekeeper and cook, sharing the work with Hester. Your wages are your wages. I'll not hold back what you've earned, but I want one thing clearly understood. Yes, she said. No more false names, no more false histories. If you're Maria Garner, you're Maria Garner here in Millhaven to everyone you meet. I won't have my household built on concealment. Agreed, she said, immediately and without hesitation. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, some small adjustment in the set of his jaw, as though he had made a decision slightly larger than the one he had articulated. All right then, he said. There's a section of fence along the north pasture needs mending. I'll be out there most of the day. He straightened from the fence rail and looked at her for one more moment. Thank you, he said, for telling me the truth when you had the chance. He walked away across the yard, and Maria Garner stood at the south pasture fence and watched him go, and felt something she had no immediate name for begin to unwind itself from around her chest. The weeks that followed were different in a way that was hard to describe, as though the air in the house had changed its quality. The lie had been the source of attention Maria had not fully recognized until it was gone, and without it the days had a different weight. She was lighter in them. More present, more genuinely herself in ways that surprised her. She learned the rhythms of the Broken Spur with the same careful attention she had brought to every environment she had ever had to navigate. She learned that Denny was 21 and came from Georgia and was homesick in a quiet way he covered with cheerfulness. She learned that Hester had opinions about everything and shared them freely and was usually right. She learned that the cook stove had a temperamental left burner that had to be coaxed, that the supply room key was kept on a nail behind the door rather than on the hook beside it, that the horses in the south pasture liked to drift toward the creek in the afternoon heat and needed checking. She learned Abraham's rhythms too, because they shared the space of the house, and the rhythms were impossible to miss. She learned that he rose before sunrise without apparent effort, that he took his coffee black and his meals practical, without complaint or excessive praise, but always with a quiet appreciation that was genuine rather than performed. She learned that he read in the evenings when the work was done, serious books of history and land management, and the occasional novel that he would set face down when she came into the room as though he were slightly embarrassed to be caught enjoying fiction. She learned that he was patient with the horses and the ranch hands in a way that was not weakness but genuine steadiness, the kind of evenness of temperament that comes from knowing who you are and not needing to prove it. She also learned, very gradually, that he was watching her, not in an intrusive way, not with the calculating attention of Victor Coles or the self-serving attention of Raymond. It was the attentiveness of a man who was genuinely curious, who was allowing himself to be curious in a way he perhaps had not allowed for a long time. She would look up from her mending in the evenings to find his gaze on her before he returned it to his book. She would be working at the kitchen table and hear him pause in the doorway for just a moment before moving on. Small things, quiet things. One evening in early September, 3 weeks after the supper table revelation, they were sitting in the main room after supper, the lamplight warm around them, Hester already retired, Denny in the bunkhouse. Abraham was reading and Maria was mending a tear in one of his work shirts, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not require filling, and Maria realized suddenly and with considerable clarity that she was happy. That this, the warm room and the lamplight and the sound of the wind outside and this man reading across from her, was something she had not had words for because she had not believed it was a thing available to her. Realization frightened her, which was itself informative. "You're very quiet tonight," Abraham said without looking up from his book. "I'm often quiet," she said. "You're quiet in different ways," he said, and now he did look up. "Tonight you're quiet the way people are when they're thinking about something they don't quite know how to say." She stared at the shirt in her lap. "You're observant," she said. "It's a useful quality in a rancher," he said. "You learn to read the signs of things, weather, cattle, people." "And what signs am I showing?" she asked. He considered for a moment, his book closed now, his full attention on her. "You look like someone who has just realized something unexpected, and you don't know yet whether it's welcome or not." Maria set down the shirt. "That is extremely accurate," she said. He waited. She looked up at him. "I was thinking that I am not certain I deserve to be as comfortable as I am here, given how I came to be here." "Comfort isn't something you earn or don't earn," he said. "It's something you either have or don't. Whether you deserve it is a different question entirely, and one I'm not sure anyone is qualified to answer about themselves." "That's a complicated position for someone who said he wouldn't build his household on concealment," she said. "I said I wouldn't have concealment," he agreed. "I didn't say past mistakes were permanent disqualifications. If they were, I'd have a considerably smaller crew and a considerably lonelier house." He paused. "I've made mistakes of my own, Maria, more than I'd like to count." It was the first time he had used her name since the night she had told it to him, and it did something she was not prepared for. It landed in her chest and stayed there, warm and specific. "What kind of mistakes?" she asked before she could think better of it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at some middle distance between them. "The kind a man makes when he's so busy being responsible that he forgets to be present. My wife, Ellen, she was a patient woman. More patient than she should have had to be. I was always out on the range or in town or dealing with some crisis or another, and she managed the house and the accounts and her own loneliness without ever demanding I notice it. And then she got sick and was gone in 6 weeks, and I spent the 2 years after her death going over every choice I'd made, and all the evenings I could have been home and wasn't." Maria listened without speaking, knowing this was a thing that needed its full space. "I don't say this for sympathy," he continued. "I say it because you made yourself comfortable here and then felt guilty about it. And I think that is a habit of thought you've developed for reasons that have nothing to do with whether you've actually done something wrong. You're comfortable here because you have worked honestly and well, and because this house has been a lonely one that needed someone in it." He picked up his book again, then seemed to think better of it and set it down. "And because," he added more quietly, "I have been glad of the company." The following Tuesday Maria rode into Millhaven for the first time. Abraham had business at the land office and offered to take her along in the buckboard so she could purchase some thread and notions she needed for mending. And she accepted, partly because she needed the supplies and partly because she was curious about the town and partly, if she was honest, because the idea of a morning in Abraham's company was one she found she actively wanted. Millhaven in 1878 was a small but functioning town on the edge of the hill country, with a main street of perhaps 15 buildings, a general store run by a man named Taggart who knew the name and business of every person in the county, a land office, a small courthouse, a saloon, a church, and a hotel that also served as a stage stop. The streets were hard-packed dirt, and the boardwalks were rough timber, and the whole place had the specific energy of a community that was building itself up from the raw material of the land around it, and was not yet certain of its final shape. Abraham helped her down from the buckboard with the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to do so, and the contact of his hand briefly around hers, steadying her descent, was brief and correct and entirely unremarkable, except for the way it was not unremarkable to her at all. They parted ways at the corner of the main street and agreed to meet back at the buckboard in an hour. Maria went to Taggart's general store and spent a pleasant 20 minutes selecting thread and buttons and a small quantity of good muslin. And Taggart, who was a talkative man of late middle age with the shopkeeper's gift for simultaneous conversation and commerce, mentioned without particular subtlety that she was from the Atkins place, and said it was good to see Abraham bringing someone to town, and that it had been a hard 2 years for the man. Maria paid for her purchases and said nothing she would not have been comfortable with Abraham hearing. She was coming out of the store and onto the boardwalk when she stopped. Across the street, standing outside the saloon with his thumbs in his belt and the particular loose-legged stance of a man who is not in any hurry but is paying careful attention to everything around him, was a man she had never seen before but who was looking at her with the focused intentness of someone who was looking specifically, not generally, but at her. He was perhaps 40, lean, with a face that had been in the sun too long and eyes that she could not quite read at this distance. He was wearing a dark coat despite the heat, and he had the look of someone who had ridden a long way and had not come with friendly intentions. Maria kept her face neutral and her walk steady and went back to the buckboard, and when Abraham appeared from the land office 10 minutes later, she told him about the man. Abraham's expression did not change dramatically, but something sharpened in it. What did he look like? She described him. Abraham was quiet for a moment, then said, "Get in the buckboard. I'll be back in 5 minutes." He crossed the street and went into the saloon, and Maria sat in the buckboard and kept her hands folded in her lap and made herself breathe. Abraham came back in less than 5 minutes. He climbed up and took the reins and turned the horses back toward the ranch road before he said anything. Nobody in there knew him, he said, which in a town this size means he only just arrived. He'd bought a drink and asked no questions yet. He paused. The bartender said he asked whether there was a good place to get a meal and stay the night, said he was passing through. He was looking at me very specifically, Maria said, not the way a man looks at a passing stranger. I know, Abraham said. He did not say anything else for a moment, watching the road. Is there any reason someone might have come looking for you, in connection with what you told me, the men you mentioned? Maria thought about Victor Coles and his unpleasant smile. She thought about the men who were not the patient kind. She had been in Texas for 6 weeks. She had thought with the irrational optimism of exhaustion that she had gone far enough. There might be, she said. Abraham was quiet for another mile. Then he said, "Tell me everything you know about the people you were running from, everything you left out before." She told him about Victor Coles. She told him about the men Raymond owed money to, though she knew very little about them except that they had been impatient. She told him that she had taken nothing belonging to Raymond or to Victor, that she had no information about Raymond's location or his assets, that she was worthless to them as a source of anything except, possibly, leverage. Leverage how? Abraham asked. If Raymond surfaced anywhere and had any remaining affection for me, she said, which I very much doubt at this point, but Victor would not necessarily know that. They'd use you to draw him out, Abraham said. Yes, Maria said. Abraham nodded slowly. All right, he said, here's what we're going to do. What he did, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his adult life solving practical problems in practical ways, was ride into Millhaven that same afternoon and have a conversation with Sheriff Dale Purcell. Maria did not accompany him on this trip. She stayed at the ranch with Hester, who listened to the abbreviated version of the situation with her typical sharp-eyed equanimity and said only, "You should have told him sooner," which Maria could not argue with. Abraham returned an hour before supper. He came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and said, "Purcell is going to keep an eye on whoever this man is." He tracked him to the hotel and confirmed he's registered under the name Carl Finley, which is almost certainly not his real name, and that he's from Kansas City, which fits. Purcell's going to watch, and if the man makes any moves toward this ranch or toward you in town, he'll handle it. And if Purcell can't handle it, Maria asked. Abraham looked at her steadily. Then I will, he said simply. He said it without dramatics, without the chest-puffing certainty of a man performing his own toughness. He said it the way he said most things, with the quiet directness of a man who meant what he said and did not bother saying things he did not mean, and Maria felt something shift in her chest again, that uncoiling warmth she was becoming increasingly reluctant to fight. Carl Finley, or whoever he was, remained in Millhaven for 4 days. Purcell kept watch. On the 3rd day, he was seen having a long conversation with Taggart at the general store, asking questions about the area ranches and the people who worked them. And Taggart, who was a gossip but not a fool, had answered in the deliberately vague way of a man who knows he is being fished and has no intention of being caught. On the 4th day, Carl Finley rode out of Millhaven heading north, and Sheriff Purcell sent word to the Broken Spur that the stranger had gone. The relief Maria felt was enormous and also mixed with a disquieting awareness that this was not necessarily over. Victor Coles was not a man who gave up easily. He had sent one person. He could send another. She said this to Abraham that evening, and Abraham said, "I know, but we have some time and we're going to use it." He did not explain what he meant immediately. Instead, over the following week, Maria became aware of small changes in the shape of things at the Broken Spur. Abraham began introducing her in Millhaven, when they went to town for supplies, as Maria Garner, not as his housekeeper or as a woman who worked for him, but simply as Maria Garner, with the tone of someone introducing a person whose presence was fully established and not in need of explanation. Sheriff Purcell was given her full real name, and the names of Victor Coles and Raymond Coles, and the nature of the situation, which Purcell received with the practiced calm of a man who had heard many varieties of complicated history, and was not in the habit of judging those who brought it to him. And one afternoon, about 10 days after Carl Finley's departure, Abraham came in from the range earlier than usual and found Maria in the parlor, mending by the window, and he sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "I'd like to talk to you about something." Maria set down her mending. "I have been thinking," he said, "about your situation, the practical aspects of it." "Yes," she said. "You're in a precarious position as long as you have no local connections of your own. No family here, no property, no legal standing in the county that anyone is obliged to honor. If someone came looking for you and wanted to cause trouble, the trouble would be yours to handle largely alone." "I've been aware of that," she said. "I've also been thinking," he continued, and here his voice changed very slightly, became more careful, the voice of someone choosing words with more than usual attention, "about the nature of this house and what it's been missing, and what it needs in order to be something more than just a working property." Maria waited, very still. "I'm going to say something that I want you to hear without feeling obligated by it," he said. "I am not saying it to resolve the practical problem, though it would resolve the practical problem. I am saying it because I have been intending to say it for several weeks, and the practical situation has simply made me stop waiting for a better time." "All right," she said. He looked at her directly, in the straightforward way that was completely characteristic of him. The way she had come to understand meant he was being completely honest and expected the same in return. "I would like you to consider whether you might be willing to stay here permanently, not as a housekeeper, as my wife." The parlor was very quiet. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was going golden across the pasture, and somewhere in the distance a bird was singing, and Maria Garner sat very still and thought about a tin box under a floorboard and a borrowed name on a train platform and a night of lamplight and confession, and the long strange journey from there to here. "You should know something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I came here with nothing, less than nothing, because I came with a lie. I have no family, no money, no standing of any kind. I am 25 years old, and my history is a tangle of other people's mistakes and my own bad judgment. I am not, in any practical sense, what you would have selected if you had actually chosen deliberately. I'm selecting deliberately right now," he said. She looked at him. She thought about what trust meant, she who had trusted badly before, she who had reason to be careful beyond the ordinary caution of women in a world that required caution. She thought about 8 months with Raymond and how certain she had been. She thought about 6 weeks with Abraham and how different the certainty felt, not the bright, dazzling certainty of new infatuation, but something quieter and more fundamental, the certainty that comes from watching a person be consistently themselves across dozens of ordinary days and finding that every ordinary day reveals something more to admire. "I would need time," she said, "to be certain." "How much time?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "More than this." "But less than forever, I think," he nodded. "Then take the time," he said. "I've waited 2 years. A few more months won't change anything that's worth having." The months that followed were among the most peculiar of Maria's life, in the very best possible way. She was courted by a man who did not rush, which turned out to be both deeply reassuring and, in its own way, almost unbearably slow, because she found as the weeks passed that her own feelings had considerably less patience than she had anticipated. He brought her things that were practical rather than showy, a better pair of work gloves because he had noticed her hands were suffering from the brine and the rough weather, a bottle of the particular ink she had mentioned once and only once preferring for her letters, a sturdy hat with a wider brim because the Texas sun was merciless, and he had said simply that he didn't see why she should squint when she didn't have to. He asked her opinions about the ranch and listened to them seriously. He taught her to ride, patiently, with none of the condescension that might have been expected of a man teaching a skill he had spent 30 years acquiring. She, in turn, found 100 ways to make the house more than it had been. She put curtains in the parlor window and reorganized the kitchen stores so that Hester, whose knees were increasingly troublesome, didn't have to climb for the high shelves. She started a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, nothing ambitious at first, just herbs and some tomatoes, and when the first tomatoes came in, Abraham stood in the kitchen garden with her and tasted one and said it was the best thing he'd eaten in years, and the way he said it, simply and without embellishment, made her understand that the compliment was not about the tomato. In October, a letter arrived. It was from a lawyer in Kansas City. It informed Maria, in the formal and distant language of legal correspondence, that Raymond Coles had been located in Denver, Colorado, in the employ of a mining concern, and had been compelled under various legal pressures to make restitution to his creditors, of which Maria was one. The letter enclosed a bank draft for $87, which was less than Raymond had taken, but more than Maria had expected to see again, and a note from the lawyer saying that Victor Coles had been informed that Maria Garner had no relevant information about Raymond's activities and had been crossed off the list of persons of interest accordingly. Maria read the letter twice, sitting at the kitchen table, and then she sat very still for a few minutes. When Abraham came in for his midday meal, she handed him the letter without comment. He read it. He looked at her. "Is this a relief?" he asked. "It's the end of something," she said. "That feels like a relief, but it also feels strange, as though I've been looking over my shoulder for so long that I'm not immediately sure how to stop." He set the letter down on the table between them and said, "You have time to learn." In November, a week before Thanksgiving, Maria was in the parlor with a book she had borrowed from Abraham's shelf, a history of the Republic of Texas that she had begun reading with the genuine interest of someone who was starting to feel that this land's history was also becoming her own, when Abraham came in from the range earlier than expected, his coat dusty and his face carrying the particular kind of serious expression that meant something had happened. "What is it?" she asked, setting the book down. "We lost 6 head from the south pasture," he said. "Fence was cut, not an accident." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "It's been happening to other ranches in the county too. Jim Howell lost 8 last week. The Martins had their water tank fouled the week before that." "Who's doing it?" Maria asked. "Nobody knows yet," he said. "Purcell's been looking into it. There's a land company out of Austin that's been making offers to buy up smaller ranches in the county. 3 families have sold already. The feeling is that someone working for that company is trying to pressure the holdouts." Maria looked at him. "You've had an offer," she said. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise, though he was a man who was hard to surprise. "How did you know?" "You went very still when you mentioned the land company," she said. "And you've been careful when mentioning the Martins and the Howells, the way you're careful when something is close to home." He was quiet for a moment. "They made an offer in September. I declined. They've made 2 more since then. The price goes up each time, which suggests they want this land specifically." "Why this land?" Maria asked. "The creek," he said. "The Broken Spur has the longest stretch of reliable water in this part of the county. If you own this land, You control access to water for 3 other ranches." He said it flatly, without drama, but Maria heard the weight under it. The Broken Spur was not just Abraham's livelihood. It was Jacob Atkins's work, and his father's before that, and the thought of it being taken apart or absorbed by a faceless company from Austin was something that reached a part of Abraham Atkins that could not be measured in dollars. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Keep saying no," he said, "and find out who's behind the fence cutting before they take more than cattle." He did find out, in the way that things get found out in small communities, through the patient accumulation of small observations and the willingness to listen carefully to people who thought they were saying less than they were. It took 3 weeks and involved Purcell and Denny and a very sharp-eyed tracker named Webb who worked periodically for the Broken Spur, and in the end the man responsible for the fence cutting was a hired hand from 3 counties over who had been paid by a manager from the Austin Land Company. He was arrested. The land company received a strongly worded communication from Purcell and the county judge, and the offers stopped coming. Through all of it, Maria had been present in ways she had not initially expected of herself. She had organized the household to accommodate the increased pressure of those weeks, had made sure the meals were solid and the supplies adequate and the books she kept for Abraham. She had taken over the accounting in October when it became clear that he had no time for it, were accurate and current. She had sat with him in the evenings when the strain was visible and not demanded that he talk about it if he didn't want to. And she had talked about other things when talking seemed needed, and she had been quiet when quiet was better. One evening in the middle of December, sitting by the fire in the parlor while a cold front pushed a thin rain against the windows, Abraham looked up from the papers he'd been reviewing and said, "I don't know what I would have done without you these past 2 months." She looked up from her mending. He was not the kind of man who said things like that easily or often. When he said them, they meant something. "You would have managed," she said. "You're very good at managing." "Managing alone is different from what this was," he said. She set down the mending. Outside the fire popped and settled. "Abraham," she said. "Yes," he said. "My time," she said. "I think it's up." He looked at her very carefully. "Up meaning I've taken it," she said. "The time I said I needed, and I know now what I couldn't have known in September, which is that what I feel when I think about leaving here." As she paused, looking for the right word. "It's not fear. And it's not just comfort. It's something that has no good name except that losing it would be losing the best thing I've found." He set down the papers. He stood up from the chair. He came to where she was sitting and he held out his hand and she put hers into it. And he held it in both of his in the way he'd held the coffee cup on the night she'd told him her name, with that same careful, deliberate steadiness. "Then let me ask you properly," he said. "Yes," she said before he'd finished the sentence. He laughed, a real laugh, the first genuinely unguarded laugh she had heard from him, and it was a very good sound. "You didn't let me finish," he said. "I didn't need to," she said. They were married on a Saturday in January of 1879, in the church in Millhaven, with Reverend Caldwell officiating and Hester in the front pew making no attempt to conceal her satisfaction, and Denny in a borrowed coat trying to look dignified and mostly succeeding, and a good portion of Millhaven in attendance because Abraham Atkins was a known quantity in the county, and people were glad for him. Maria wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue wool with white at the collar, the best sewing she had ever done, because she had taken extra care with every stitch. Abraham wore his good black coat and a white shirt that she had pressed herself that morning, and he looked at her when she came down the church aisle with the expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and finds that the thing he waited for is better than he imagined. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the ranch, Hester having coordinated the cooking of several neighboring women with the strategic efficiency of a general deploying troops, and there was music from a fiddle played by a man from the Howell Ranch, and dancing in the cleared barn because the parlor was not large enough, and the whole of it had the quality of something that was happening in the right order at the right time, which was not something Maria had had much experience of before, and which she therefore appreciated with her whole self. They danced together, Maria and Abraham, and he was not a graceful dancer, but he was a sincere one, and she laughed at something he said close to her ear, and he kept his hand at her waist in a way that felt proprietary in the best possible sense, the sense of a man who is not taking anything for granted but knows what he values and is not shy about it. Late in the evening, when the guests had mostly gone and Hester had retreated to her room and Denny to the bunkhouse, they stood together in the parlor. The fire burned low, the lamplight easy around them, and Abraham looked at her and said, "Well, Maria Atkins." She tried the name in her mind. Maria Atkins. It fit entirely differently from Clara Whitfield, which had always felt borrowed because it was. This one was hers, a new one, chosen rather than assumed, built on a foundation that was honest all the way down. "Well," she said back and smiled. Spring came to the Broken Spur in the way Texas springs come, sudden and extravagant, the land going from brown to green in what felt like a single long exhale, and with it came changes to the rhythm of life that Maria felt in her body before she had conscious language for them. She told Abraham on a warm evening in April, sitting on the porch steps watching the last of the sunset drain from the sky, and she did it by simply taking his hand and placing it flat against her middle and looking at him until he understood. He went very still, in the way he went still when something had moved him more than he knew how to immediately process. Then he turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was something she would carry for the rest of her life, transparent and unguarded and completely real. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I'm certain," she said. He put both arms around her and held her against him in the warm evening air, and she could feel his heart beating against her shoulder blades, steady and strong, like everything about him. The pregnancy was easy by the standards of the time and the place, which Maria was grateful for and did not take for granted. Hester had delivered more babies than she could count in her years on the frontier, and was a calm and competent presence through all of it. Abraham was attentive without being smothering, which was to say he was exactly himself, practical and steady, and there whenever he was needed. In November of 1879, on a cold, clear night with stars spread across the Texas sky in extraordinary abundance, Maria Garner Atkins gave birth to a son. They named him Jacob, after Abraham's father, who had broken the first ground on the Broken Spur and built it into something worth passing forward. Jacob Abraham Atkins arrived in the world with a strong voice and dark hair like his father's, and the immediately apparent intention of being in charge of everything he could reach, which was nothing yet, but which, Abraham said with considerable amusement, would clearly be corrected as soon as possible. Maria lay in the wide bed in the room that had once been just Abraham's room and was now theirs, holding this small, serious-faced person who was entirely new and also somehow already completely himself, and Abraham sat on the edge of the bed with his arm around her shoulders and his eyes moving between the baby and her face with a kind of wonder that he made no effort to conceal. "He looks like you," Maria said. "He looks like himself," Abraham said, which was, she thought, very typical of him. Hester came to see the baby and said he was fine and healthy and would be a handful, in the tone of a woman delivering good news. Denny came and looked at the baby with the expression of a young man for whom small humans were still somewhat theoretical and congratulated them with genuine warmth, and backed out of the room with considerable relief. Life settled into new rhythms that winter, the rhythms of a house with a baby in it, which are loud and unpredictable and exhausting and deeply, fully alive. Maria navigated them with the same adaptive attention she had brought to every environment she'd ever had to navigate, and Abraham navigated them with the same steady patience, and between the two of them they managed and more than managed. There were hard days, because there are always hard days. The winter brought a stretch of weather that threatened the early calves. Abraham spent 3 days and nights out in conditions that made Maria's chest tight with worry, and when he came in on the 4th morning, frost-grimed and exhausted, she pulled him straight to the fire and didn't let him argue about it. There was a sickness that went through the bunkhouse in February and took Denny down for a week, which put more work on Abraham at an already demanding time, and Maria took up the parts she could take up without question and managed the rest. But there were days that were the opposite of hard. Spring evenings on the porch with Jacob between them on a blanket, reaching for anything he could get his hands on. Summer afternoons in the kitchen garden with the smell of tomatoes and basil, and the sound of Abraham talking to one of the horses in the yard. That low, even voice he used with the animals that was not different in quality from the voice he used with people. The first time Jacob laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him by a cat that had wandered through the parlor with an expression of complete indifference, and the way Abraham and Maria had looked at each other across the room over that sound with the wordless shared recognition of people who are experiencing something for the first time together. 2 years passed in this way, the Broken Spur growing and prospering under the combined attention of 2 people who both understood work and were not afraid of it, and Millhaven growing around them, 2 new streets and a school and a second church, and the particular energy of a frontier town that is beginning to believe in its own permanence. Maria had become, in the way of things that happen gradually and then are simply true, a central figure in the community in ways she had not anticipated. She organized a lending arrangement of books through the church, people leaving and taking as they were able, which was not a library in any formal sense but served the same function for a community that had more readers than books. She helped 3 different women in difficult domestic situations, not with drama or judgment, but with the practical assistance of someone who knew what it was to need help and not have it, and the reputation she built was one of competence and discretion, which in a small town was as valuable as currency. She also wrote, occasionally, not for publication, though that would come later, but for herself, careful observations about the land and the people and the particular quality of life in this part of Texas, the way the light moved across the hill country at different hours, the texture of the air before a thunderstorm, the way the ranching community functioned as a web of mutual dependencies that was more complicated and more interesting than it appeared from the outside. Abraham read what she wrote when she showed it to him, which was not always but sometimes. He read it the way he read everything, carefully and with full attention, and his comments were few but precisely useful. "You see things I don't see," he said once, after reading a piece she had written about the way the community had reacted to a particularly bad drought season, the small economies and the mutual aid and the way people calibrated their pride against their need in different and individually logical ways. "You see plenty," she said. "You see it differently." "That's not a bad thing," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." In the spring of 1882, Jacob was 2.5 years old and fully in command of his legs and most of his opinions, and Maria told Abraham over supper that they were going to need to think about expanding the house. Abraham looked at her. She met his eyes. He set down his fork. "How far along?" he asked. "About 3 months," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched beside her chair, which was not a graceful position for a man of his size but which he accomplished without apparent self-consciousness, and took her hands in his. "Are you well?" he asked first before anything else, which was so completely characteristic of him that she felt her throat tighten. "I'm very well," she said. "Better than last time, honestly." He held her hands for a moment. "A girl this time," he said. "Maybe, she agreed. It was, in fact, a daughter, born in October of 1882 on a warm fall evening with the door of the ranch house open to the air, and she came into the world with a quieter manner than her brother, but with eyes that were immediately and distinctly watchful, the eyes of a person who intended to understand the world before she committed herself to any particular position about it. They named her Ellen Clara, Ellen for Abraham's first wife who had been patient and good and deserved to be remembered, and Clara for the woman whose name Maria had borrowed, the woman whose accidental kindness had set everything in motion. Maria had thought about this naming for a long time and had offered it to Abraham with some uncertainty, not knowing how he would feel about the first name, and he had been quiet for a long moment, and then said it was exactly right, and his expression had the particular quality of grief remembered and honored rather than grief still open, which she understood as a good and healthy thing. Jacob regarded his sister with the measured assessment of a small person evaluating a new element in his world, and after a week or two of this assessment, decided she was acceptable. He was not demonstrably affectionate, being very much his father's child in the matter of displayed emotion, but he was protective in the small instinctive ways that were impossible to fake, putting himself between Ellen's blanket and anything he considered a potential threat, which at 2.5 included the kitchen cat, a loose shutter that banged in the wind, and Hester's broom. Hester herself, at 67, was beginning to slow in ways she would not acknowledge, and that Maria navigated carefully, redistributing the heavier kitchen work without framing it as redistribution, accepting Hester's management and direction as genuine and valuable even as she quietly carried more of the physical labor. Hester was the history of this place in a way nothing else was, and Maria understood that clearly. The Broken Spur in 1882 was a different thing from what it had been in 1878, though the land was the same, and the creek ran as it always had, and the hills on the horizon were unchanged. It was fuller now in the specific way of a working property that has found its purpose and is fulfilling it. The cattle were healthy, the accounts were solid, the crew had grown by 2 hands and they were good men whom Abraham had chosen with his usual care, and the house was different. Not in its bones, which were the same timber and stone that Jacob Atkins had built, but in its quality of life, the curtains in the parlor windows, the kitchen garden against the south wall, the bookshelves that had grown from 2 shelves to 5, the sound of children in the rooms, the smell of things cooking with intention, the particular warmth of a house that is genuinely inhabited rather than merely occupied. One evening in December, Abraham and Maria sat together on the porch after supper, the children asleep inside, the cold, clear air around them alive with stars in the way that the Texas hill country sky in winter is alive with stars, which is to say that the vastness of it is almost too much for the ordinary human heart to hold. "I want to ask you something," Abraham said. Maria had her coat pulled close and her hands around a mug of coffee, and she looked at the sky and said, "Ask." "Are you happy?" he said. It was such a simple question, and he asked it with such genuine and serious inquiry, as though the answer was something he intended to think about carefully and respond to honestly rather than something he expected to be merely reassuring. Maria considered it the way he would have wanted her to consider it, without reflexive politeness, without the easy yes that would close the subject. She thought about where she had been and where she was. She thought about the tin box under the floorboard and the train platform and the borrowed name. She thought about the supper table on an autumn evening when everything had cracked open and she had thought her last place of safety was lost, and how instead of that being the end, it had been the beginning. "Yes," she said, thoroughly and specifically and with full knowledge of the alternative. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at the stars together for a long time without saying anything, which was one of the things they did very well. In the spring of 1883, a letter arrived that Maria had not expected, and which caught her off guard in ways she had to sit quietly with for a few minutes before she could think about it clearly. It was from Clara Whitfield. It had been forwarded through the agency in St. Louis, which had closed the file on its arrangement for the Broken Spur Ranch, but apparently still existed and still received correspondence. Clara Whitfield had heard, through some chain of acquaintance that Maria could not entirely trace, that a woman named Maria Garner had traveled to Texas in her place and married the rancher in question. She had written not with anger, which would have been entirely understandable, but with a curiosity that was almost entirely devoid of bitterness. She had written that she had ultimately not gone to Texas, having met a man in Kansas City in the intervening years and married him there. She had written that she hoped whoever had made the journey had found what she herself had found, which was someone worth staying for. She had written that she bore no ill will. She had signed it simply, Clara Whitfield Marsh. Maria read the letter 3 times and then sat very still for a while. Then she wrote back, the most honest letter she had written in her life, which began, "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay and an explanation that is long overdue." She told Clara everything. The train platform, the carpet bag, the borrowed name, the fear that had driven the choice, the shame she had carried for it, and the life that had grown from it despite everything. She told her about Abraham and about Jacob and about Ellen Clara. She told her that the name she had borrowed had been returned to the woman it belonged to as soon as she was asked for her real one, and that what she had built on her own name was something she worked every day to be worthy of. She did not know what Clara Whitfield Marsh would make of this letter. She sent it anyway. A response came 8 weeks later. Clara wrote that she was glad. That was almost all she said, and it was enough. Abraham read both letters when Maria showed them to him, as she showed him most things now, because keeping things from him had long since stopped being possible, not from any compulsion but from genuine inclination. "You should keep these," he said, handing them back. "I intend to," she said. "For the children," he said, "eventually, when they're old enough to want the whole story." She looked at him. "The whole story includes a good deal of deception and fear and bad judgment," she said. "It includes all of that, and also how people can be honest when they have the chance to be, and how far you can go from a bad beginning," he said. "Those seem like useful things for children to know." The following years accumulated the way good years do, not in dramas but in ordinary days that are full of meaning without requiring fanfare. Jacob started school when the Millhaven schoolhouse opened in 1884, and took to reading with an appetite that delighted Maria and amused Abraham in his contained way. Ellen Clara grew into a child of remarkable observation and selective speech, who said little and missed nothing, and whose assessments of the world around her, when she did speak, were so frequently accurate that both her parents found themselves listening with more attention than they would have given an average 5-year-old. Denny got married in 1885, a woman named Josephine from a farm family 2 counties over, and the wedding was held at the church in Millhaven, and the supper afterward at the Broken Spur, which had become the kind of place where community things happened naturally, because the people who lived there understood hospitality as a fundamental rather than a performance. Hester declined, gracefully and over her own strenuous objections, through 1885 and into 1886, and in the fall of that year, Maria sat with her in her small room off the kitchen and talked to her honestly about what was happening and what should happen next. And Hester said, in the tone of a woman who had been managing her own affairs for 68 years and was not about to stop now, that she had a niece in San Antonio who had been asking her to come, and she supposed she had put it off long enough. She left on a Tuesday in October, in the buckboard driven by Denny, with her belongings packed in 2 bags, and she looked back at the house from the road with an expression that was unreadable and private, the expression of a person reckoning with time in a way that belongs entirely to them. Maria waved from the porch and did not try to say anything that would have been inadequate to the moment. Hester Bramble lived another 7 years in San Antonio, which was longer than anyone except Hester herself expected, and she and Maria exchanged letters regularly through all of it, letters that were practical and honest and occasionally, on Hester's side, quite funny in the particular dry way of someone who has seen everything and is no longer startled by any of it. The kitchen at the Broken Spur, in the absence of Hester, became entirely and comfortably Maria's domain, which it had been functionally for some time, but was now also formally. And she ran it the way she ran most things, with competence and genuine enjoyment, and the occasional consultation of the cookbook she had acquired from Taggart's store and annotated extensively in the margins. In 1887, Maria was 34 years old and the Broken Spur was 36 years old, and Millhaven was a town of something over 300 people, and the three of these things were woven together in ways that made sense when you looked at all of them together. She and Abraham sat on the porch one evening that summer, the children inside doing their lessons or their reading, and the evening was the particular Texas evening that comes in August when the heat breaks just enough at sundown to remind you that air can feel good on skin, and they were not talking, which was still one of the things they did very well. "I was thinking today," Abraham said, "about the night you told me your name." She looked at him. "I was thinking about the fact that I had known something was wrong from the second week," he said. "I had known the description didn't match. The agency had said chestnut-haired and you're dark. They had said average height and you're quite a bit shorter. I had known for 2 weeks before that letter came." Maria stared at him. "You knew." "I had a strong suspicion," he amended. "I didn't know the why of it, but I knew something was off. And I kept thinking about it and I kept deciding to let it continue because whoever you were clearly someone who needed to be somewhere safe and you were doing no harm, and the house was," he paused. "The house was better with you in it." From almost immediately. "You let me continue," she said, "for 2 weeks. I gave you the time to tell me yourself," he said, "which is what I did with the letter as well. I could have confronted you the morning it arrived. I thought about it and decided to give you supper first." Maria looked at him for a long moment. Then she started to laugh, a real laugh, the kind that takes over fully and refuses to be contained, and Abraham, watching her, allowed himself to smile in the way he almost never did, the smile that reached his eyes completely and changed his whole face. "You gave me supper first," she said, still laughing. "You gave me supper first. Seemed only right," he said. "A person should eat before she has a difficult conversation." She reached over and took his hand, as she had done in 100 ordinary moments and which still, at 34, after 9 years on this land, felt like something she was choosing rather than something she was accustomed to. "Abraham Atkins," she said. "Maria Atkins," he said. The name still fit 9 years on. Better, if anything, for the wearing. In 1888, Jacob was 8 and Ellen Clara was 5, and there was a third child on the way. A fact that Maria announced to Abraham over supper on a Thursday in March, and which Jacob received with the equanimity of a person who has processed the concept of babies sufficiently to no longer find them a novelty, and Ellen Clara received with the watchful seriousness with which she received most new information, storing it for future analysis. The third child, born in November of 1888, was another son, named Thomas after no one in particular, except that both of them liked the name. Thomas was cheerful and round and interested in absolutely everything from the moment he arrived, and Jacob, at 8, adopted the role of older brother with an almost exaggerated seriousness that was extremely funny to watch because he was, in this, almost exactly his father at 8 years old, or so Abraham said. The Broken Spur went into the 1890s as a prospering and established ranch, well regarded in the county, staffed by people who stayed because the work was fair, and the treatment was fair, and the place had the quality that places have when they are genuinely well run. Abraham had put in a more substantial barn in 1889 and expanded the south pasture, and the cattle were consistently good, which in the unpredictable economy of the cattle business was the result of consistent attention and good judgment rather than luck, though luck played its part. Maria's small writing project had become, by 1890, something somewhat larger. A newspaper in San Antonio had printed 2 of her pieces, observations about ranching life and the particular community of the hill country, and had paid her a small amount for them and asked if she had more. She had more, The pieces appeared irregularly, under the name M. Atkins, which was her own preference, and which Abraham had said nothing about except that he hoped the editor knew she was worth more than they were paying her. On a December evening in 1890, with snow on the ground, which was unusual enough in that part of Texas that the children had been outside in it for most of the afternoon, Maria sat at the kitchen table writing. The lamp was warm above her, and the kitchen smelled of the soup on the stove and the bread she had baked that morning. And through the kitchen door she could hear Jacob reading to Thomas in the parlor, while Ellen Clara contributed occasional and precise corrections to Jacob's reading, which he bore with the patience of a boy who had learned that his sister was usually right. Abraham came in from checking the livestock, cold from the outside air, and hung up his coat and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and came to stand behind her, reading over her shoulder in the way he did, which she had long since stopped finding intrusive and now found she missed when he didn't do it. "What's this one about?" he asked. "Names," she said. He was quiet for a moment, reading. "Names," he said. "The way names are the first thing people give us and the last thing we answer to," she said. "The way they can be wrong and be corrected. The way they can be borrowed and returned. The way a name you choose yourself or that someone gives you in full knowledge of who you are weighs differently from the one you arrive with." He set his coffee cup down on the table and put his hands on her shoulders and read for another minute. Then he said, "This is the best thing you've written." She looked up at him. "You say that every time." "I mean it every time," he said. "Each one is better than the last. That's not a contradiction. That's just what it looks like when someone keeps going." She reached up and put her hand over one of his, and he turned his palm up and held it. Outside the kitchen window the snow was still on the ground, and the Texas night was very clear and very cold and full of stars, and inside the kitchen was warm and bright, and full of the sounds of the life they had made together from a beginning that should not have worked and had worked entirely. Maria thought sometimes, still, about the woman on the train platform, about the carpetbag and the letter and the moment of desperate, imperfect choice. She did not regret it, which she had once thought she would always regret. She had stopped regretting it somewhere around the evening. She told Abraham her real name and he had said all right, and asked her to start from the beginning, as though her story was not a problem to be managed, but a thing he genuinely wanted to know. She thought about what she had told him on the south pasture fence, the morning after, that she had come to respect him and had not wanted him to respect someone who didn't exist. She had not known then, standing at that fence in the early morning light, how completely true that already was, how much what she felt for him had already exceeded the cautious, practical terms she'd put around it. She knew now. She thought about Clara Whitfield Marsh in Kansas City with the man she had found worth staying for, and she thought about herself in this kitchen in Millhaven with the man she had found worth telling the truth to, which was the same thing expressed differently. "Stay with me for a minute," she said to Abraham, though he had not moved. "I'm almost done with this paragraph." He stayed. He always stayed when she asked. She wrote the last sentence of the paragraph and set down her pen and leaned back against him, and through the kitchen door Jacob's voice continued reading and Ellen Clara's voice continued correcting, and Thomas made a sound that was either agreement or protest. It was difficult to tell with Thomas. The soup simmered on the stove. The lamp burned steady and warm. Maria Garner Atkins, whose name was entirely her own, sat in the kitchen she had made into a home, in the house she had come to with a borrowed name and a hidden past, and a heart that did not know yet what it was capable of, and felt the deep, unshakable satisfaction of a woman who had taken the truth of herself when offered the chance and built something lasting with it. Abraham pressed a kiss to the top of her head, which was something he did without ceremony and without announcement, simply as a thing that was natural and ordinary and his. "Come to the parlor when you're done," he said. "The children are going to need someone to mediate whatever argument Ellen Clara is currently winning." She laughed and told him she would be there in 5 minutes. She sat alone in the kitchen for those 5 minutes, listening to the sounds of her house. Then she capped her pen and folded the paper and tucked it into the drawer where she kept her work, and she stood up and turned down the lamp, and she went through the kitchen door to the parlor where her family was. The Broken Spur Ranch would stand for another 60 years after that evening, handed forward from Jacob to his own children and from them to theirs, and the name Atkins would remain on it through all of that time. But what those who came after remembered most, what was told and retold through those generations, was not the acreage or the cattle or the years of good seasons and hard ones. What they remembered was the story of how it began, or rather how it truly began, on an autumn evening in 1878, when a woman arrived with a borrowed name and a rancher asked for the real one at supper, and she gave it to him, and everything that mattered started there.